Okay, Jeff, I think everyone is out of the waiting room, so feel free to begin.
Okay, so are you putting a video or something up? Oh, I just see your picture. Oh, there it goes. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second Intensive Management Workshop. I'm Jeff King, Chair of the Production Committee. And first of all, I want to take the opportunity to thank the ladies at the Kentucky Soybean office, Debbie, Becky, Ray. They have done an outstanding job in supporting us and getting all this put together so we can have this new version of Zoom meetings. And a big shout out to Ray for I've got to read a little commercial here and putting it in a font size that I can see without glasses. So with that, this is brought to you by the United Soybean Board and the Kentucky Promotion Board. And we have a little commercial here. So the Intensive Soybean Management Workshop came about in 2014 after a group of farmer leaders decided that meetings that tackle tough issues and explore problems we all face on the farm without having the product for sale to fix those problems. There was a great way to invest in your checkoff dollars. Since its beginning, the soy checkoff has existed for one reason: to create profit opportunities for you, Kentucky soybean farmers. Dr. Chad Lee has moderated these workshops for several years, and one thing he said that has really stuck with me: it is not about the beans in a bin, it's about the bucks in the bank. We like to focus on the ways we can help increase in your operations profitability. Sometimes that's driving yield, and sometimes that's lowering input costs. Either way, we want to help you increase your bottom line. We talk a lot about sustainability, and while there's no standard definition for that term, I think long-term profitability is one of the principles of sustainability. Just as we take care of the soil, the water, and the air, we have to be good stewards for our operation and leave them financially healthy for the generations to come. In addition to driving yields and minimizing costs, the checkoff is consistently looking for innovative new uses for our versatile crop. We call these crop opportunities. From feed to biodiesel to car tires, U.S. soy has evolved into ultimate raw material. Each of these numerous diverse uses began as a single crop opportunity. Creating crop opportunity is a state-by-state, country-by-country, innovation by innovation, around-the-clock mission. That's why the checkoff will always have an eye on the future, looking for the next crop opportunity that can make a difference in your bottom line. Simply put, a crop opportunity is your checkoff dollars at work. New revenue streams created, existing markets expanded or revived in new, exciting ways to open up demand and drive sales for your soybeans. The Kentucky Soybean Board and United Soybean Board are pleased to offer intensive management workshops to increase the crop opportunities found in your operation. Now, without further delay, I will turn the program over to Dr. Chad Lee. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Jeff. How you doing today?
Doing extremely well. Glad to be with you today.
Great. Well, looking at the temperature outside, it's a really good day to be inside. And I think we've got a really good program for you all today. So we'll get right into we're going to have 3 speakers today. We'll probably take a small break between our second and third speaker. Feel free at any point to ask a question if you want to. If you'd rather, put them in the chat, and I'll go through the chats and try to read those off at the end of each session if we want to do it that way. And then at the very end, I believe we've got a question and answer session as well with Chris, and we've also got a question and answer with Drs. Knott and Haramoto after their presentations. And so we want your questions to be asked, and we want to answer those questions. And we really appreciate you being with us today. Our first speaker is no stranger to anybody in Kentucky, and that's Dr. Carrie Knott. Dr. Carrie Knott is an associate extension professor and an agronomist for corn, soybean, and small grains at UK. She earned her undergraduate degree from Western and her graduate degrees from the University of Kentucky. She's based in Princeton, where she's also the director of the UK REC. Dr. Knott works with all things research related to soybean management, both in full season and double crop soybeans. She also administers the Kentucky Soybean Extension Contest. With that, please help me welcome Carrie Knott.
Good morning. All right, Chad, can you see my presentation?
I see your slides, your PowerPoint. There's your presentation.
All right, is it full screen?
Full screen. Looks good.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. I was very happy to get the invitation from both Jeff and Debbie Ellis. And so it's always a joy to share our research. You know, most of us researchers are pretty nerdy. We want to tell everybody about what we found out, particularly when it is funded by the Kentucky Promotion Board. And so much of the work today I'm going to talk about has been a culmination of, gosh, I guess the last 7 years since I came to the University of Kentucky as a professor. And so, you know, when you start talking about intensive management of double crop soybeans, and so this is something I've been working on a long time, and really it was prompted by producers that I visited either in the state or visited in the board meetings of the Promotion Board and the Kentucky Soybean Association as well. And so when you start thinking about, okay, how do you push double crop soybean yields? Not only that, but how do you make sure they're profitable? You know, the first things that come to my mind are really not restricted to double crop soybeans. I mean, this list of agronomic management considerations is the list that you could pretty much put on any crop, except for maybe the seed inoculant, but any crop that we grow here in Kentucky. We need to look at variety selection. We need to look at planting date. What plant population are we going to target? What about row spacing and seeding depth? Of course, inoculant for soybean production, and any pesticide and nutrient management we're going to be looking at, okay? This isn't restricted just to double crop soybeans. But today, I'm going to focus on several of these that I've looked at over the past years. Many of these have been not just my work, but many of these across the university and across other universities as well have been funded by the Kentucky Soybean Promotion Board. And these are just the ones that I know off the top of my head. I'm sure over the years they've funded every aspect of double crop and full season soybeans. And so I want to make it very clear that the board is very supportive of making sure that producers know how to profitably produce these crops. And so when we talk about variety selection, I'm not involved in this part of it, but I have to mention that here in Kentucky, we have a very strong variety performance testing program, not just for soybean, but most of our commodities and forages as well. And this is actually pretty unique. A lot of states have been getting away from doing this because some of the companies aren't supporting it, but the companies know that in Kentucky, our producers demand this information. We have very strong programs that put out very good data. And so when you are thinking about variety selection, I do encourage you for any crop to go ahead and look at our variety performance trials. And like I said, the Promotion Board does fund this to some extent each year. In terms of the research I've done on variety selection, it hasn't necessarily been on a particular variety, okay? I'm not trying to decide if you should grow a Pioneer or an Asgrow or an Agrigold or any other variety. I'm not forgetting any of them, and I'm not highlighting any of them, but really what we wanted to know was for double crop soybean, what is that relative maturity group that's going to give you the highest yields, okay? And so when you think about variety selection, it's really not an additional cost. Regardless of what you grow, you're going to have to choose your variety, right? You're going to have to invest the time to decide which variety. And we do rely very much on our seedsmen to help us figure that out because they know these varieties very well. And so they're a good resource. But we had been hearing chatter in other states that maybe manipulating that relative maturity group was resulting in higher profitability. And so for double crop soybean, I wanted to investigate that. And so we spent the first year, 2016, kind of just trying to figure out how we were going to do it. And then in 2017 to 2019, we were able to go ahead and deploy a really nice study that looked at relative maturity group by seeding rate. And so we were looking at a confounding effect of basically a late 2, which is absolutely insane in double crop soybeans, right? But as researchers, we want sort of those wide extremes so that we can determine, you know, where your failure is and where your best chances of success are. And so we went from a late 2, a mid 3, sort of that early 4. And so we ping ponged between 2 varieties for the early 4 and the late 4, just because of what was available on the market. The variety we started with actually went off the market, which isn't unusual, right? They only stay on a few years. Then we also looked at seeding rates. And so again, we had an insanely low seeding rate for double crop soybean of 50,000 seeds per acre. And then we increased it in 50,000 seed increments up to 250,000. And so I'm just going to kind of focus right now on the relative maturity group. And we're kind of averaging over all those seeding rates. So keep that in mind for later. But basically what we found is that, not surprisingly, this late 2 really was a dud, right? And so it yielded quite low. I think and this was across about 6 environments. We had it at 2 locations for 3 years here at Princeton. We had it on a well-drained crater soil. And then we had it back on the fragipan soil. And so I think one year on the fragipan soil, we yielded like maybe 20 bushels or something. It was pretty dismal just because of the growing conditions we had that year. But what we found is that this later maturity group, the longest sort of maturity group that we grow here that's adapted, this late 4, yielded the highest, okay? You know, in retrospect, that's not all that surprising, right? Because that's been the recommendation of the university for years, is that you really, for a double crop soybean, you want to grow the longest adapted maturity group that you can get. But seeing how it's been, I'm guessing here 30 to 40 years since we've really looked into this, I felt it was very important just to make sure that, given the changing weather conditions, the changing genetics, the changing management strategies we've had so many changes in the last 30 to 40 years. I thought it was important just to make sure. So I did feel pretty good that our recommendations were still nice for the university. The other thing that we did, and this is really a benefit for being at a university and having access to training students. You get to do a lot of data collection while you're training students on how to do things, right? And so not only do the students get the experience and the knowledge and the confidence to be able to do research and to know how to look at data, but they also get to collect a lot of data for us that will benefit producers in Kentucky. And so one of the things we did with this study, we did not have time to count nodes because or pods, because that's very labor intensive. So what we did is a little bit less time consuming, but it still took some time, where we looked at how many seeds were produced per square foot meter. Okay, and so we basically just took a sampling and weighed the seeds and counted the seeds. And what we found again here is that the treatment that had the most seeds per meter square was that late 4. And so that probably is what's contributing and driving this yield bump, okay? And so although it was an easy and simpler way, as an agronomist, I just couldn't quite wrap my mind around what seeds per meter square really meant, you know, in the real world. And so I backed into how many pods that's going to be. And so to do that, I'm not going to bore you with exactly how I did that, but we did determine the acreage that's in a meter square. And then what we did is we looked at our harvest population, averaged across that seeding rate study. Remember, it was a seeding rate study all the way from 50,000 to 250,000. So on average, it was about 78. And so if we assume 19 plants per square meter and 3 seed per pod, then what we're looking at for this data is that we had on average about 29 to about 39 pods per plant. And so that actually is about right. So in other research where we have counted nodes, typically we're in that sort of lower 30 to 40, so 31 to 41 nodes per plant. And so this seems pretty reasonable. But it just goes to show you how much of an impact you can have just on one simple decision of a variety. And don't get me wrong, these 2.8s in 1 year pretty much potted on the ground. And I think the first year we did it, I think it was 2016, they barely reached about a foot high. So, I mean, it was almost impossible. It actually was impossible to harvest those. We left a lot of pods on there. But we didn't concern ourselves with that because we wanted to have it mimic what a producer would do as much as we could. So, and let me say at any time, if there's questions, you know, I don't know if you can unmute yourself, but go ahead and chat them in, and Chad, go ahead and interrupt me. I would rather this be interactive. I know that's really hard on Zoom, but I want to make sure that your questions get answered instead of me just droning on and on. Okay, so the next thing we looked at, and we looked at quite a bit again with a graduate student. This project actually was funded by the Promotion Board for many years, I think 4 in total, by the time you start our preliminary year where we worked out the kinks, was planting date. And you know, when you first think about this, it's like, Carrie, are you insane? Planting date? Planting date's dictated by wheat harvest. You know, why are you monkeying around with planting date? Well, you know, it is dictated by harvest, but as a farmer, you control when that wheat harvest occurs, right? So you can make the decision to let it field dry to about, you know, 13.5, 14%, and that's fine. But you can also make the decision to go ahead and harvest it at greater moisture, you know, from, you know, 15 to 18% moisture, put it in a bin, dry it down, market it, you know, do other things that are outside the agronomic realm that really do give you back control on when you plant your double crop soybeans. We know in full season research that, you know, the earlier you can plant, the better your odds are of increasing yield, right? And so when you look at harvesting at greater than 15%, and typically from 2016 to 2019, in those 4 years, we were able to harvest, I think, almost every year close to 16% moisture. Sometimes it was 18. But in general, across those 4 years and 2 different fields, so about 8 growing environments, that was about a 2.5 week earlier planting date when we harvested it at higher moisture. That's a long time during the summer. That is a lot of time for those soybeans. And in some years, I don't think this was a 2.5 week difference. I think this was closer to a 10 to 14 day difference in the planting dates, but you can see that really you can get those soybeans quite a bit further along. And in terms of range, you know, we were 8 to 26 days, depending on weather. I think in 2016, I don't have it here, but I think it was only about 4 or 5 days difference because it was a really hot year and really low humidity. And so it really drove those wheat grain moistures down much more quickly. several years, I think 2 years, we had a lot of rain. And so one year we were able to get the weed off. And then it was 2 weeks before we could plant because it was such a deluge of precipitation. One year we were just delayed on wheat harvest, right? And we were able to plant immediately after we were able to harvest. And so, as you know, those conditions change each year, but really it's driven all by weather and how wet it is, or even how dry it is, whether we can get those beans in. So when we look at the 2017 to 2019 data in terms of soybean yield, you can see that we were basically at 57 bushels per acre when we let it field dry versus about 66. So we had a pretty good yield advantage for harvesting early. And that pretty much, with rounding, is about 1% a loss per day. And so that's pretty close to sort of older estimates as well. But it's almost double what we predict as a yield loss per day for full season soybeans. And that's not all that surprising, is it? These double crop soybean environment is so much more condensed, right? It's so compressed that these plants have to do a lot in a short period of time. And if you take any days off that, you're going to really impact yield in the long run. So the next thing we looked at was seeding rate. Not only that seeding rate study I talked about earlier, which was confounded with the maturity group as well, but also from 2017 to 2019, we wanted to kind of look at, all right, we don't have enough time or resources to look at all of these with all the other inputs we wanted to investigate. So we just decided to look at 150, which would kind of be on the lower end for a double crop seeding rate. And then we wanted to look at a pretty intensive management, you know, about 250, which is, it happens in the state, but it's not all that common either. Typically we have closer to, you know, in the middle of these. And so what we found is that for seeding rate, you know, I'm sure much of you are aware the university doesn't really recommend a seeding rate. We really recommend a harvested plant population. So we say that typically in most years, double crop soybeans will give you the highest chance of a profitable yield at 140 to 150 harvested plants per acre, okay? And so when we look at the seeding rates in that 3-year study, what we found is that our harvested plant population for the 150,000 seeding rate was only about 115,000 plants per acre. That's well below our recommended 140, 150. It wasn't until we increased that seeding rate to 250 that we were able to get our harvest population to about 150. That's a whole lot of stand loss, right? So to get our recommended harvested plant populations, we really had to increase that seeding rate quite a bit. And so we know this, as agronomists, we know there's something in soybeans, whether it be plant to plant competition or whatever it is. I don't know that we fully understand the mechanism, but we know the higher the seeding rate, the greater the stand loss. And it's not just early vegetative stand loss. We're not talking about just early seeding loss. It seems to occur throughout the growing season as well. So, do we have a question?
Yes, Carrie, the stand loss numbers, were they more severe on the Fragipan soils than they were on the Crimper?
Yes, they were.
Okay.
Yes, the Fragipan for sure had between 8 and 10% greater stand loss in a normal year. In a year that had quite a bit of rain, it was more severe. I don't remember that number off the top of my head, but it was. We know that those Fragipan soils are much more stressful, and we end up with greater stand loss. And in the Fragipans, Chad, the stand loss occurred early. So that V2 sort of plant population that we checked we had a greater stand loss there than we did on the well drain crater. And then it just kind of continued through the season to harvest, because then we took R8, or right before harvest, we took harvest plant populations as well. And so
Okay.
that's kind of what we were seeing. Again, I
All right.
wish we could understand that mechanism, but wow, that would be a lot of time, right? I don't know how you do that, but
Well,
anyway.
we'll, if there's time at the end, we may throw that back in on the question and answer session.
Okay.
On some of that mid-season stand loss.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Chad. Again, if there's any questions, you guys pop in at any time, or make Chad pop in, because that was a good question. So basically what we saw is that we really didn't maximize our yields until we got to those higher harvested plant populations, which is not surprising, right? So on average, we had about 62 bushels for that lower seeding rate and closer to 65 up here. And although it was just a couple of bushels statistically, it was very significant. When we look at the seeding rate data, again, when we look at harvest population, you see that there's quite a bit of stand loss that's occurring. I'll have to move this over. And in this study, we never reached our target of 140 to 150. You see that? Our maximum was of harvested plant populations was only 120. So I feel like we left yield on the table in that study. Although still it was those higher seeding rates that gave us the greater yields. So in terms of seed inoculant, I hope, again, let's come back to this with questions at the end, but I mean, it's something we see nationally. Chad and I just had a sort of email string go around to all the soybean specialists in the nation. And it was a younger faculty member asking about such marked stand losses in these higher seeding rates, and thought he did something wrong, but he didn't. You know, this is something we see year in and year out, and we just don't quite understand the mechanism as to why it happens. In terms of seed inoculant, I think, you know, our general recommendation, we know that Brady rhizobium is needed to fix nitrogen, and we have to have those nitrogen fixing nodules to provide the nitrogen, right? We just have to. Soybean uses a ton of it. In most cases, we don't recommend it for double crop soybean production unless the field has been out of production for a while, has a history of problems with nodulation, remains saturated for a long time. And by a long time, I mean you're in river bottoms that stay flooded from fall to spring, right? And so we're talking about very extended periods of time that it's underwater and anaerobic. But a couple years ago, there was a lot of chatter going around from some of these new products. And so these products, I'm not saying don't work. I'm not saying they do work. It's just some products that we examined back in 2016. It was actually Chad's project, but I put out a location here at Princeton as well for double crop soybeans. We did full season as well. But what we found for the double crop soybeans is that the companies, or I don't know if it's the companies, someone was saying, yeah, at the labeled rate or the 1X rate, you don't really see a yield benefit to seed inoculant. But once you start increasing it to 2X or more, you're going to get a yield benefit, is what was going around a few years ago. And so Chad and I looked into that and said, okay, here's our non-inoculated control. These are fields that had been in recent soybean production, so we did not expect that they would need any sort of inoculation for the seed. And what we found is that it didn't matter, you know, the 1X or the 2X rate, whether it was dry or liquid or whatever the product was, there was no yield increase to seed inoculants regardless of rate or product or anything else when you're looking at fields that we would not think needed it. We saw similar results for the full season soybeans as well. And so we only did that 1 year, just because it seemed so clear that there was no yield benefit to additional input. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand that seed inoculant is a very cheap insurance. And, 2 years ago, not this year, we were looking for any opportunity to reduce inputs, right? The bean prices just were not that strong. And even a $2 to $3 per acre input would really kind of squeeze that bottom line. Luckily, we weren't quite there this year, and I'm very happy to say that. So, okay, the next thing we looked at was seed treatments. Yes, Chad.
Question about the seeding rate on the double crop, and it probably came in earlier and I just missed it. Those high seeding rates, were those economic, even though you didn't get to the higher population that we wanted? Were those 250,000?
Yes.
Were they more economical?
So in this study, and I didn't put in the economics because Jordan Shockley's been doing a lot of work. So this is for those of y'all that have heard me or my student Catherine Rod talk a lot. It's now Dr. Catherine Rod. But she did find that this seeding rate at 250 was the only profitable input we had. And so we looked at several different inputs where we were increasing the seeding rate, seed treatment, which we'll talk about in a minute, foliar pesticides, which we'll talk about in a minute. But really the only input that we had that was profitable over our current recommendations was this higher seeding rate. And I can't remember exactly what the level of profitability it was, but it was several dollars per acre. And I can get that to y'all later in the chat box once I get off here and look at that data. But it was just this higher seeding rate, Chad, that increased profitability over any other intensive input that we looked at. Okay, like I said, in Catherine's work that was funded by the board, we also looked at seed treatment. We were growing Pioneer varieties that were donated to us. Thankfully, we do appreciate that quite a bit as researchers. It saves us a lot on input costs. And so we used their premium, Pioneer Premium seed treatment, they call it, which at that time was Allegiance and Evergold for fungicides and then Gaucho for an insecticide. And so when we looked at treated and untreated, we saw no yield benefits. We're talking about basically, I think this was 58 bushels per acre versus 60. For any of you in the audience that had seen some of Catherine's preliminary work, I think in the first 2 years, we thought there was a yield advantage. And statistically, we were seeing a yield advantage for the first year for sure in terms of the seed treatment. In the second year as well. And so what we went back and looked at was, okay, what happened in those years that maybe made a impact on these seed treatments? And really it came down to June precipitation. You guys remember 2017 we thought was wet, and then we had 2018 and it was almost twice as much rain in June as what would be our typical 30-year average, which is this line here. And so I think that, we didn't investigate this, but if I had to guess, it would be these really saturated, just sort of waterlogged conditions after seeding that, after planting, that allowed these seed treatments to kind of give a small yield benefit in these years. 2019, it was more of a normal year and we saw no yield benefit. And the yield benefit here was small enough that once we put all 3 years together, there was no advantage to seed treatments at all in terms of yield or profitability either for double crop soybeans. But it does kind of highlight the fact that if you do need a seed treatment or you do need some sort of pesticide, that it typically does pay. The question is, can you predict if it's going to be a wet season or not to be able to make that decision? And so another thing we're going to be doing pretty soon is looking at the probability of yield increases with some different statistical analysis. So stay tuned. Hopefully over the next year or so, I'll have that data out for you guys to say, okay, yes, it increased yield, 3 bushels, but we'll be able to tell you, 75% of the time, for example, I'm just making up that number, 75% of the time you will get a yield increase of this many or more bushels. And so again, stay tuned for that. So Catherine also spent a lot of time looking at foliar pesticides. And so really I've kind of distilled these down into very particular, seeding rate versus foliar pesticide versus seed treatments. But she also looked at it in a more general sense. And so if you want that information, please reach out to me in terms of a total sort of agronomic management package. But just for simplicity's sake this morning, I kind of wanted to distill it down to each individual. And so from 2018 to 2019, we had 4 fields. Again, a Crider, a Fragipan in 2 years, so that's 4 fields. And we went in and just a blanket application, just prophylactically at R3, we said we are going to apply a fungicide and insecticide. And in those years, it was Quadris-Top and Warrior 2. Then she went out every single week and scouted for thresholds. And what she was doing for insects was looking at defoliation rates, and then also kind of just visually looking at what insect populations were there. I don't know that she was necessarily doing sweeps, but she was visually kind of looking at what she was finding as she was walking through all the plots. And so in 2018, it was R4. R4 kind of triggered an insecticide application based on defoliation rates. And I think that threshold was about 30% defoliation. And in 2018, it was bean leaf beetles that were wearing us out. I mean, they were everywhere. And so we sprayed at R4 versus R3. 2019, again, we had a threshold trigger for insecticides at R4. That year it was stink bugs that were all over the place. We also ended up spraying a fungicide. And so the variety we had was pretty resistant to frog eye leaf spot. But when she scouted around between the R3 to R4 growth stage, she was starting to see some frog eye come in. And then we had a projected, I think it was a tropical storm, I can't remember which one it was, that was going to blow up from the Gulf. And so we were going to get 5 to 7 days of rain or cloudy weather or high humidity, when you think about the whole 5 to 7 day outlook. And so based upon our recommendations, and we talked to Dr. Carl Bradley, the pathologist for soybeans here, and he said, yes, I would certainly spray, and I would tell any farmer to spray if they're seeing frog eye leaf spot and this tropical storm was coming in. And so we went ahead and triggered that spray. So what we found is that basically those 2 years over those 4 fields, the blanket application at R3 actually increased yield. And so again, we're talking about 58 versus, I think this is about 52 bushels per acre. So we had a pretty decent yield increase that was statistically significant as well. And this puzzled us quite a bit, right? Because based upon tons of research over the last years, also for Carl and others, we really shouldn't have seen this huge increase for that prophylactic application. And so what we decided to do was go ahead and look at it again this year. And so we did look at it. Chad had some full season. We looked at it full season and double crop. I'm going to focus on double crop. And so I had, again, the 2 fields well drained in the Fragipan. And we went ahead and broke it out, not just for the fungicide and insecticide, but we kind of wanted to know, well, is the insecticide driving the increase? Was it the fungicide? Was there a synergistic interaction going on? Which, if you look in the literature or you talk to other people in other states, sometimes they think there's sort of a synergy going on, that when you apply both, it works better and gives the plant more yield. And then, of course, we did our scouting thresholds. And what do you figure? Go figure. There was no significant difference. It's like, really? I mean, welcome to the world of research. You know, one year it tells you one thing, the second year it tells you another, and it's so confusing, right? And it's so frustrating. And so, sorry, I'm nerding out right now, but I could not wrap my head around this. And then I started thinking about the year. Okay, what kind of year did we have? And when you go back and look at the data, so Carl Bradley's crew scouted for us for the diseases, and we did not even really get anything. Like when you look at their data, it was like 1% incidence of frog out leaf spot, 3% incidence of target spot. And so really we were nowhere near those thresholds of causing any sort of impact on yield. When you look at the insects, we were the same way. This year, we never got close to having defoliation or insect populations that even came close to reducing our yield. But remember, I told you in Catherine's work in 18 and 19, we always sprayed at R4. And so really what we're talking about is, as researchers, we always say, if you need it, it will work. This year, we did not need it. Our insects and diseases just were not at a level that we're gonna need a control, right? Does that make sense? So as frustrating as it is, it really does reinforce sort of those principles for good agronomic management. And so just kind of to wrap it up, I hope I didn't go too long, but generalized recommendations for double crop: plant as early as possible, no brainer, right? Choose as long and adaptive variety as you can for your area. So for us in Western Kentucky, it's going to be the latest 4 you can get, probably closer to Chad's way, probably a mid 4 or something like that might be a little better. Just whatever is your longest maturing. Do whatever you can to try and harvest as high a population as you can. Like Chad and I had talked about, that can be a struggle with these stand losses. Seeding depth. For double crops, you want to go a little deeper, right? So if you're planting in February, this end of my state, you're probably not going to want to plant 2 inches. You're probably going to want to plant about 1 inch, 1.25 inches, right? Because you want to keep it in the warm zone. For double crops, you're going to try and reach that soil moisture typically. So you're going to want to go deeper, 1.5, never more than 2, because the seed might run out of food to go forward. I still think seed treatments probably are not needed as a year in, year out thing, neither inoculants. Foliar pesticides, again, use them when you need them. But the only way you know if you need them is scouting. And so really you need to invest that time in very vigilant scouting. And so, and I kind of glossed over the nutrient and weed management. That's key, right? You can't have nutrient or weed problems and maximize your yields. And so please look at those recommendations. And so with that, I'm done. Chad, what other questions did we have?
I don't see any that filtered in just yet, Carrie. So I'm sure there'll be a few more when we get to the question and answer session.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank y'all so much. Reach out to me at any time if y'all have questions.
All right, thank you. And Carrie's going to be on here for a little while yet. So we will jump right into our next speaker, which is also one of our colleagues, Dr. Erin Haramoto. And Erin, while I'll read a short bio, go ahead and get your video up and start sharing your screen, if you will. Erin is an associate professor in weed science at UK. Among her many responsibilities, Dr. Haramoto is studying when and how cover crops can help manage weeds. And so her focus is a lot on cover crop and weed management, whereas other people are looking at cover crops and agronomics or cover crops and soil carbon. She's focusing on this weed management issue. She teaches 3 courses at UK, and she earned degrees from George Washington University, University of Maine, and Michigan State University, which I also hold very dear. Most of you know that I went to Michigan State for my PhD as well. You may not know that the Michigan Soybean Promotion Board paid for my PhD. And so I worked on the soybean project while I was there. I reported to them every year on the progress and updates and proposals, and really appreciate their investment in me. It really helped encourage me to do what I'm doing today. So Carrie was talking about how this helps out grad students. I'm one of those grad students that benefited from that. We're really glad that Erin is with us. She's really made a great addition to our overall team, and specifically in the weed science area. So with that, Erin, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chad, for the introduction. I'm here today to talk with you all about soybeans and cover crops. Yes, I did my degree at Michigan State. I didn't work with soybeans up there, and you'll note that of the 3 places that I have at least gone to school, that Michigan's the only place where they grow soybeans. But I have, in between all of those degrees, worked in various other locations where they do grow soybeans. So anyways, and I've also been here at UK since 2014 and growing a lot of soybeans here, as you'll see. So a brief outline of what I thought we would cover today. We're going to start with the bottom line. So what do cover crops contribute to soybean yield? And I'll show you some of my results from research in Kentucky, and then we'll look at some lessons from elsewhere as well. I'll go through a few specific ways that I think cover crops can benefit soybeans. Of course, we're going to talk about weed management today because that's mostly what I do, but we'll touch on some soil related topics as well. And then if you decide that you are going to cover crop, or if you're going to help a producer that you work with implement cover crops, or you want to change up what you're doing, maybe rethink your goals, we'll go through just a little bit of things that can help you make these decisions about what types of cover crops to plant, when to plant them, how to use them, etc. So first things first, what do cover crops contribute to soybean yield? I'm going to summarize some of my research from UK. I've again been growing soybeans from here since 2015. We're going to look at 13 site years of experiments. So these are going to be classified by the year and by the experiment. I do want to point out that these experiments are all designed to do different things. So sometimes we have weed management protocols we need to follow where we actually can't kill weeds. So some of these, one of them you'll see is particularly low yields. So it's kind of an oversimplification to look at cover crop yield versus no cover crop yield, but we're going to do that anyways to try to get a picture of what it looks like here. All of these are going to be after soybeans after rye, except when you see a W at the bottom, that means they're soybeans after wheat, a wheat cover crop. So here's a figure again summarizing 13. So some of our site years of data, we have more. And we're always looking at yield here on the left, following a weedy fallow in these brown bars and following mostly cereal rye in these green bars, again, unless you see that W down here. So first thing you'll note is the bars, at least in most of our site years of experimentation, are pretty equal. We had similar yields in 12 of 13 of those site years. One case here back in 2017 where we did have lower yields following that cereal rye than following fallow, a trend of that in another year. And both of those I attribute to some stand issues. This one, I'll actually show you a picture of where we just didn't get the seed in good contact with the soil. So for the most part, at least at our research, all of this is at least is in either Lexington or in Woodford County. We have pretty similar yields following cereal rye than following a weedy fallow. So moving to another part of the world or of the country where they also grow a lot of soybeans and are interested in cover crops. So the previous slide I just showed you is all small plot work that we're doing. The Practical Farmers of Iowa is a group that you may be familiar with. They do a lot of on-farm research. And so in this particular trial that I'll show you results from, that research entailed a strip of cereal rye and a strip left bare for weedy fallow on production farms. We're always looking at soybean yield. And so over an 8-season period, they accumulated 25 site years that participated in this experiment, and they found something reasonably similar to us. So in 60% of those site years, no change in yield, whether it was following, the soybeans were following rye or following bare. Some cases where they had increased yield following the cover crop, and then 2 of their 25 site years, they saw yield reduction, which they also attributed to stand problems, so not planting properly into that residue. So these on-farm trials are really essential. They teach us a lot about how this is going to work on farm. So with production size equipment, and then also the scale of variability that you're going to have in larger areas. But just as a plug, we do really need these randomized and replicated studies to help us figure out, to study the variability in yield and also figure out the mechanisms. So why was it actually just the stand here causing yield reduction in these 2 years? And especially what's driving these yield improvements in some of these years. So doing both of these is really essential. And I did forget to mention, bad omission here, that a lot of that research that we do on soybeans has been funded by the Kentucky Soybean Promotion Board. So thanks for that support. Okay, so an even bigger picture look people have looked at more recently is trying to use the satellite imagery and remote sensing to get like what's happening on a nationwide scale. So they've published some preliminary results on this to see if they can actually do this. So they use remote sensing to identify individual fields that were using cover crops across 3 of the I states from 2008 to 2016. They can also estimate soybean yields from those satellite imagery, from that satellite imagery. So they can combine that. Again, we're talking about like a huge, massive effort here to do this. They can combine that though with soil and weather and be looking at what parts of the country, what specific types of soil and what weather conditions are associated, drive that difference or drive the yield that we see following cover crops. And so what they found is that, again, across these 3 I states in these years of the study, that cover crops tended to be associated more with poor soils in these regions. So low soils with low productivity. They also found, again, glossing over a whole lot of stuff happening here, that the fields that had cover crops in them were associated with a small but positive yield increase in soybean. So about 1/3%, which is nothing to write home about. But when you think about all the things that could go wrong, again, across all of these years, all these locations, having a positive yield effect is a good thing. And what they also found was that the longer these fields were in cover crops, the more that yield benefit increased. So we would expect this, especially if cover crops are being used on these poorer soils. But this type of analysis doesn't tell us why. So again, if we take all of this in aggregate, we might have relatively few impacts of these cover crops on soybean yield, which you can look at as a really positive thing, or you can look at that as a relatively negative thing. The last one, again, looking at this really large scale, concluded that they were seeing more yield benefits when cover crops were used for longer, especially on these poorer soils, where they might be providing more benefits, but we don't know why. So that opens up some avenues for research. How exactly do cover crops help those less productive soils? Are they actually increasing organic matter over that relatively short time frame? That's that 8 years, 9 seasons that it was in production. That's a relatively short time frame to be increasing soil organic matter by any sort of meaningful measure. Is it just because they're holding in water? Is it just because they're holding the soil in place a little bit better? And then once we learn more about that, or also improved weed management maybe, we can use these to help us tweak management to maybe be improving yields and adopting cover crops more on areas that would benefit from them. Okay, so we're going to take a jump now and look at some of our research from UK on how cover crops can contribute to weed management. As Carrie said, please feel free to jump in with questions at any time or also save them till the end. I'm going to show a fair bit of our data in here. As Chad mentioned, I teach a lot of classes, so I try to get students thinking about how is it that we know this? Where is this recommendation coming from? But I'm also going to try to summarize these into more digestible chunks. So hopefully if I start rambling about slides too much, Chad will virtually wave his hands and tell me to stop, and I'll cut to the chase. All right. So what are we gonna, so to set context for this first, cover crops can rarely, if ever, substitute for herbicides and still result in adequate control. So I'm not going to talk about trying to draw down your weed problem enough solely using cover crops and not using any herbicides at all. So we're not talking about substituting here. We are going to talk about integrating cover crops into weed management systems that do use herbicides. So how can they help us improve the efficacy of our herbicide applications and ultimately over the long run be reducing the risks that we're going to be developing additional herbicide resistance. So how can we use cover crops as a tool to make herbicides more effective and more efficient? And I see this as happening in two ways. Well, this is not my idea. This is the way that we view cover crops helping with weed management. If we have fewer weeds present, so if we can suppress their emergence, reduce their density with the cover crops, then we have fewer that we have to kill with those herbicides. Also a lower chance that any one of those weeds in a field, any given field, is going to just by chance have a resistant allele in it that confers resistance to that herbicide. We also want to be reducing weed growth so that when we do apply these herbicides, weeds are smaller and easier to kill. So these are the two things we're going to focus on today. How can we use cover crops to do these two things? And I'm going to talk about this from a couple perspectives. One of those is going to feature a lot of our research looking at mare's tail management, which has been supported by the Soybean Board. So how can we use cover crops to suppress mare's tail that emerges in the fall and early in the spring? So we're talking about while that cover crop is growing, preventing those weeds from emerging and outcompeting those that have emerged. Then we'll switch gears and talk about in-season soybean weed management. Just as an aside, you'll see a lot of gaps in the stand here. This is from that site year where we did have a yield reduction in the soybean yield reduction following cereal rye compared to after fallow. So we had some planter issues in this year. Okay, so for this cover crop and mare's tail thing, what are we going to look at? We're going to look at how winter cover crops can kill mare's tail that's already emerged in the fall, and then look at it also whether they're effective in suppressing that spring flush that we often see. Now, I haven't been here in Kentucky for that long, but at least in, let's see, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 6 of the falls that I've been here, we've had pretty stout fall emergence in at least 5 of those years. That doesn't mean we have fewer plants emerging in the spring. We also have them emerging in the spring. So my experience is at least that we seem to be in this sweet spot where we can have fall emerged mare's tail and spring emerged mare's tail too. Given that it's we have widespread glyphosate resistance throughout the state, controlling this weed, and that is really competitive in soybean, and that we have fewer herbicides that can effectively kill it in soybean, this is something that we really need to be dealing with. So this is what we're going to be looking at, trying to answer whether we can lower the density at planting, so have fewer weeds to kill, and then again, outcompete those plants so they're smaller when it's time to spray. So if you do have a bunch of fall emerged mare's tail, what do you do with it? This is a photo from one of our experiments. Again, we had a graduate student working on this project that was funded by the Soybean Board. So that lucky graduate student got to go out and count these mare's tail plants between these orange stakes quite often, let's say, during the fall, winter, and spring. So a photo from that field, these plants emerged in September, October. We're starting to get ones in February that are 2 inches in diameter. By March, they're starting to get 3 inches or even greater in diameter. And then by the time we need to be treating weeds before planting soybeans in early May, these weeds are 6 to 8 inches in diameter and starting to grow taller too. So at that stage, we start to get nervous about what effective products do we have to be killing those weeds. So the best management practice across this region is if you have a bunch of these fall emerged plants, you need to kill them when they're small. So that means either spraying or doing something in the fall or really early in the spring so that you're taking all of these out so you don't have that concern at planting. But unless you, so if you spray these, let's just say in like middle of fall, like early November, you still have good weather to spray. And so you go out and you spray all the ones that have emerged in the fall. Especially if you kill off all the vegetation, so you're killing all the weeds, you've really opened up the soil for mare's tail to keep emerging throughout that fall, winter, and early in that spring period. So yeah, you've killed back the larger plants, but then you have new ones coming up. So what are you going to do about these? So you could consider adding a residual herbicide in if you're going to be spraying in the fall or early in the spring. That might not last you through the whole mare's tail emergence window, which again can be what, September through April or May. And then that also leaves you with fewer options for residuals in crop. And you might need those to deal with things like palmer and water hemp, for example. So is there an alternative? So to having to spray in the fall, spray again in the early spring, what's a possible alternative? So we did a trial comparing those fall herbicide applications with the cover crop for managing these fall emerging cohorts. We did this in this wonderful, wonderful field that had a really high density of fall emerged plants, like 1,000 plants per square meter. So that's a lot of mare's tail seedlings that we can count, or this student could count, and track their fate. So what we did is we got an initial density. We planted a cereal rye cover crop in late October, so after most of these had emerged. And then we also had a weedy fallow treatment too. So two things we're comparing. And then we sprayed an herbicide after the cover crop was planted. This was saflufenicil. It's the active ingredient in Sharpen, and it's a PPO inhibitor. And then we went back and kept measuring these, or counting these plants. So what happened? Well, if I can get my slide to go, that fall herbicide was really effective in killing plants that were there. So now we've reduced our density pretty dramatically here, with and without the cover crop. By the next spring though, wherever we sprayed off those weeds, and we didn't have any residue preventing additional emergence, where that fall herbicide was applied, now we have a new flush of emergence coming up in that spring. And so where we only applied that herbicide and did nothing else, now we've got 100 plants per square meter. And this is I think this was in late March, early April that we counted these. So now we've got another problem on our hands, and we have to kill all those plants. Where we had the cover crop though, the cereal rye cover crop itself was really effective in suppressing that spring flush. We didn't have it at all. The plants are using light primarily, that's preventing the germination of those seeds that would normally be emerging at that time of year. So we only had 2 plants per square meter. This is still something that you're going to need to treat when you go to plant. You don't want 2 mare's tail plants growing per square meter. So you need to think about what it's resistant to, think about your program at that time. But again, we've accomplished one of our goals, which is to have fewer weeds around that we need to be killing with those herbicides. So that overwinter cover crop can be a really effective tool in managing mare's tail that emerges in the fall, and managing mare's tail that's going to emerge in the spring too. So we think that this is a really good option for managing this problem weed. Now, one of your other options is to till. Tillage is very effective in reducing mare's tail density, but I'm guessing that a lot of you aren't really interested in that management tactic. So just really quickly, let's get to that second point about mare's tail size. This is some research that was conducted in Pennsylvania. And I know these figures are a little strange, so let me just walk you through what they're showing here. Basically, just like us, they were looking at mare's tail in a weedy fallow. So that's the top group on the figure here, and in cereal rye cover crop. That's the bottom. They measured mare's tail density, which is given as N numbers here, and the size of the mare's tail plants when they were getting ready to do their pre-plant herbicide application before planting soybeans. So this is I think they're in Pennsylvania, but I think this would be around early May for us, late April, early May for us. Don't tell Chad and Carrie, but I plant my soybeans in mid-May in Lexington. It works well for getting weeds. So they also lastly did this over 2 years. So the 2 years of their experiment are shown in the ones on the left and the ones on the right. And so the distribution of these bars within each one is showing you basically how many plants were that size, the size corresponding down here. So we've got 2-inch diameter plants, 4-inch diameter plants, and 6-inch diameter plants. So a couple of things to point out on this figure. Where the mare's tail were growing in this weedy fallow area, they tended to be larger. So around the time of their soybean, their pre-plant application, they were around 2 inches in diameter, 5 centimeters. And there was also a really big range in this plant size. So they had some that were out here around 5 and approaching 6 inches in diameter at that time. So you can think about, if you don't want to keep having to apply herbicides to manage these mare's tail as they come up, are you going to be is your application going to be effective in treating some of these larger plants? So in contrast with cereal rye, they not only had lower density, so look at the N numbers here, less than half in each year of the plants were present with the cereal rye. Those plants were smaller. They were about an inch and a half in diameter, and then they had none of those really big plants in either year. And that's a competitive effect of that cereal rye cover crop against those weeds. So this is summed up nicely. This concept is summed up nicely in this picture. So which one would you rather treat before you have to plant? Ones that are this big or ones that are this big? What's your likelihood of success of getting those in one application or needing to go back and respray those? So at least from a mare's tail point of view, we looked at a couple of things. These winter cover crops are effective in killing those fall emerged plants, suppressing that spring flush. So we have fewer plants that we have to kill at planting. They're also effective at competing with mare's tail that does emerge. So we have smaller plants when it's time to spray. So we've checked a couple of our boxes in terms of our goals of using our cover crops to help our herbicide-based weed management. So I want to just go through just a couple of things from other folks' research about this, the benefits to weed management in season now. So we're talking about residue, most likely on the soil surface if you're growing no-till. So how that residue prevents weeds from emerging, and then also slows their growth down by immobilizing some nitrogen and reducing the light penetration close to the soil that those weeds are going to need to grow. So again, we're going to look at our two things, whether these residues can reduce density and whether or not these residues can result in smaller plants that we need to kill. And if you're thinking about timing a post-emergence application at this time, slowing the growth of those weeds means that you have a little bit longer until they reach that target size for post-emergence. So our 4 to 6 inch window. And hopefully that's that size range. We want to be a little bit closer to 4 inch. So hopefully we have longer until we need to get to that. So I'm gonna just focus in on that second part here. So are we slowing the growth so that we have a little bit longer window for our post-emergence control? This figure is similar to the one we just looked at. We're looking again at, now we're looking at smooth pigweed height. Again, following, in soybeans following weedy fallow or following cereal rye. And what they did in this experiment is they timed their post-application to when weeds were 4 inches tall following that cereal rye, so with that residue. And just to point out that in the weeds following the weedy fallow, so with no residue, were a lot bigger. And again, you have a few individuals out here that are 10 inches tall at that time. So if you're trying to target your post to that 4 inch size, these weeds in control are going to reach that 4 inches much earlier than ones growing in cereal rye residue. I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. So coming a little bit closer to home, Dr. Steckel in Tennessee has also done some work with this, looking at that window that you have to get your post-emergence applications on. So this is in corn, don't tell anybody, but it illustrates the point. Weeds in corn, this actually is Palmer amaranth, growing following some of these legume cover crops, either hairy vetch or crimson clover. Again, they were timing their post-emergence application to when those weeds hit 6 inches in height in this case. And weeds growing in their fallow plots, so without any cover crop residue, were 9 inches tall at that time. And so if you translate this into days, what they determined is that if you want to be applying your post when your weeds are 6 inches tall, you had an additional 3 to 4 days to do that, that if you were following a cover crop relative to no cover crop. So this is a function of a couple of things. Weeds are slower to emerge, so you can be delaying their emergence, and then also slower to grow because that residue is tying up some resources that they need. I can show you this one too. This is another student that came out of doing research in Dr. Steckel's lab that basically showed, this is in soybeans. they showed the later you terminate your cover crop relative to planting, and the more residue you accumulate, again, the longer that window is that you have until palmer reaches 4 inches tall. Importantly, so something you need to think about if you're talking about accumulating a lot of residue, again, is can you plant into it? They were able to show with their operation that they had similar soybean density and yield following these varying amounts of residue. This horribly messy figure illustrates the same for our research here in Kentucky. So I've just plotted up the amount of cover crop biomass here. So as we go over to the right side, we've got more residue, and then our yield here on the y-axis. You see a pretty straight line. All the colored dots, again, are just from our different experiments, but you see a pretty straight line. So as long as you can get your population right, which we've done in most of our years, except for one, we're pretty good in maintaining that yield with different amounts of residue. So just to sum up all this weed management stuff, benefits to weed management from cover crops. Can you ever substitute cover crops for an herbicide application? You might be able to do this on your operation if you need to manage that fall emerged mare's tail. This is going to be dependent on a lot of ifs, and if you have questions about this, I'm happy to talk with you about this later. But really, again, I think this is kind of asking the wrong question. If we can accomplish these two things with our cover crops and our residues, then we can really be thinking about improving the efficacy of the herbicides that we do have to use. Maybe fewer resprays for poor control, and ultimately reducing the chances of developing resistance. So just to throw in a couple of things about good soybean weed management practices in general, as Carrie mentioned, this is critical to maintaining yields. So most of these are going to apply whether or not you're using a cover crop. But the first point is that you do need to terminate this cover crop timely and adequately. So you don't want that cover crop to be a weed. This a little bit ties into the second point. If you don't really have the equipment to plant into that heavy residue, then that is going to be an earlier termination time for you. You're not going to get benefits from the residue if you have all of these gaps in your soybean stand. And so if you can picture that photo that I showed, you can certainly, that's true. So that healthy crop with no gaps in it is going to be one of the major ways that we can be suppressing weeds. We still want to be using soil residual herbicides to manage weeds that are going to be emerging after planting for at least, in some cases throughout the soybean growing season. So these soil residual herbicides are compatible with residues as long as we get rainfall to wash them down into the soil to activate them, where they can be preventing weed emergence. So what these soil residual herbicides help you with is they help protect air, even if you have a lot of residue, they help protect you from where the residue isn't very even. And it's also areas where you might have lower amounts of residue as well. So still adding in your residual herbicides is key. Now, a lot of folks that work in these integrated systems are trying to do research to figure out in what cases can you maybe delay that residual application if you have a lot of residue, if that residue is nice and evenly distributed and forms a nice thick barrier to weed emergence. But we're really not there yet in terms of recommendations for how to do this. And this would also have to fit in with your system, with the particular weeds that you have and what you're growing, what traits you have, what post-emergence herbicides can be applied when in the growing season. So we're not quite there yet in terms of making these recommendations. So really scouting regularly and using these timely post-emergence applications still remains combined with the soil residual herbicides, remains critical to good soybean weed management. I'll just touch on a couple of these more soil related aspects of cover crops. And then just wrap up by briefly talking about options that I think are good before soybeans. So the first one of these is looking at soil moisture. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of how cover crops can benefit soybeans, but these are projects that I'm involved in at UK and things that I've seen in my time in Kentucky here. Okay. So we know from other studies in other states that cereal rye, especially after you use it for longer, can increase field capacity and increase plant available water. These particular numbers come from a study in Iowa. We are trying to develop those numbers here for Kentucky. So we've been monitoring soil moisture in an experiment with and without cover crops for 6 years now. This is just a snapshot from after soybean planting through the beginning of August, so the warmer part of the growing season, looking at soil moisture at 2 and 6 inches deep. And the green dots are soil moisture in cereal rye plots. The black ones are in a weedy fallow. So that residue is preventing or lowering evaporation from the soil surface, and especially helping to increase soil moisture close to the surface, which is beneficial as the soybeans are getting established. So we have a lot of work to do with this type of data set to be determining whether or not we're changing field capacity by how much additional plant available water we might be getting. But this is the type of stuff that we're working on. Do want to just make a point. This Hannah and I did a tour in the purchase a couple years ago, took this photo of pretty bad corn on the side of this slope here. What is this from? Is it from limiting moisture, limiting nitrogen? It's probably actually from limiting soil. So the more that we can be holding onto that soil with cover crops, especially as we have these intense rains in early spring, is a good thing. So I'm just going to throw that in there as well. Skip over this. Montse and Hannah and I are also involved in a project funded by the United Soybean Board. And one of the hypotheses we want to try to test is whether or not, as you cover crop for longer, do you get any more labile organic matter that can a little bit serve as slow release nitrogen fertilizer late season that might be helping to increase soybean yields and seed protein concentration. Chad, I just saw your note, and I don't actually have the time up here. Can I take one more minute?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. You've got about 5.
Oh, I
at
have
this
5
point.
minutes.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that if there's time. So in terms of choosing cover crops, especially before soybeans, how do you do this? What might you recommend to folks that you work with, or what might you want to consider yourself? So we'll talk about some of the goals of cover cropping. That's always the number one thing that I try to get people to think about. What do you want this? What do you want help with? What do you want this to help you do and accomplish in any given field? But another important thing is the window. So when can you plant these? When do you need to be terminating them in the following spring? And then also equipment considerations. So not just how can you seed the cover crop, but what type of planter do you have to deal with residue? And I do see a chat in here, a question about planting into residue. I'll put that on hold and loop back to that after we go through some of these decision-making things. So there are various selection tools online. The Midwest Cover Crop Group has a very nice one that you can enter some properties of your soil. And that they do that on a county level, at least for Indiana, Illinois, and I think Missouri's on there now too. So depending where you are in the state, you might be able to pick a county in the southern or eastern parts of those states that's relatively close to you and get more specific info for your soils. We're working on one of these in the Southern Cover Crops Council. We have a lot of information sheets on our website now, but we are working on one of those more interactive decision support tools. And NRCS also has one that's specific to the Southeast region that you can look up. It's a little funky, so I couldn't really put a link in here. So getting to this goals question, what do you want to do with that cover crop? I've listed some of those here on the left side of this table. And then if you want to be achieving those, what types of things you need to prioritize out of the plant that you're going to choose to plant as your cover crop. So for example, if you want weed suppression, we really want to have above ground biomass to be blocking light, especially from reaching the soil surface. And then after you kill it, to form that nice thick residue layer. And ground cover is part of those things. If you want to be minimizing erosion or scavenging nutrients, then having well-established below ground stuff is also important. So you can think about those goals in terms of selecting. Really, we think about small grains as working the best before soybeans. So these can be planted a little bit later in the season. They'll grow throughout the winter if we start to get above their base temperature. Cereal rye grows a little bit better than wheat over the winter. And they really give you the most bang for your buck in terms of biomass production, especially given their cost. And we do have other cover crop options that might work before soybeans, but these are often constrained by planting date or how you're going to kill them, what herbicides you need to be able to kill them off in the spring. So if you want to be prioritizing above ground biomass, which in most cases also means you're prioritizing below ground biomass with some exceptions, cereal rye is really, again, going to be the workhorse. It produces much more biomass than wheat. And you can see that from this photo that was taken, sorry, I didn't date it, April of 2017. We get a lot more, the cereal rye plants are a lot taller and thicker than rye. So if you really want to prioritize, you want to plant as early as possible and terminate as late as possible, given the constraints you might have with planters. Depending what you had there that previous season, you might need a small nitrogen application to really fill out that small grain. And think about drilling seed, especially if it's going to be dry. And I know I've had some conversations with folks that are on this workshop about trying to broadcast seed when it's dry and exactly what happens. So the planting date thing is shown by these photos on the right here. These were both taken on the same day in late November of 2017. Cover crop planted in late September versus one in mid to late October. So the earlier you can get it in, it's going to be better for ground cover and biomass. Now, where seeding rate really makes a difference is for that ground cover, especially if you are going to be planting a little bit later. Increasing the seeding rate of some of these small grains can increase that ground cover, although it doesn't really have much of an impact on biomass because they compensate so much growth-wise. Okay, so wrapping this back to the beginning, generally we're going to have pretty modest, if any, benefits to soybean yield. Again, you can look at that as a good thing or a bad thing. If you're using these to help with your weed management, to help protect against erosion, to increase soil moisture in some cases, getting all of those benefits without a negative impact on soybean yield, you can look at that as a positive. Because again, they contribute in all of these other ways. And so the more that we can learn about these contributions, the more likely we are to be able to improve our management of these cover crops to get what we want without getting what we don't want. Maybe implementing these on more acreage and receiving more benefits overall. And so a lot of the research that I presented today was funded by the Kentucky Soybean Promotion Board, also the United Soybean Board, in addition to some of our other commodity groups and some regional and federal funders. So thanks for your attention this morning. Chad, I can answer this question in here about planting into residue if that's okay. Or do you want to wait on that?
No, go for it. We're now into the question and answer session with you and Carrie. So Carrie, if you're still around, put your video back on and unmute as well, and we'll go into that.
So the question is, how are you planting into heavy residue? And that's a very good question. So we are working with 2, maybe 4 row planters when we do these research trials, and weight is a major issue for us. And it's difficult. And every year I cross my fingers and hope it works out. There are a couple ways that you can do this though. So if you have really heavy residue, I realize that some of these are going to be more feasible than others. So something that some growers do is they roll it first. So they roller crimp it. Often that roller crimper is mounted on the front of the tractor with the planter in the back. And so what that does is it does increase the uniformity in how the residue flops down. There are some specialized pieces of equipment, like Dawn Biologic makes one that's like a little mini roller that actually mounts right in front of your planter unit. And so it can roll and crimp and again, create that more unidirectional, even residue stand. That helps so that the plants, if you plant in the same direction, all of the plants are flopped down in that direction, but it doesn't necessarily alleviate all of the concerns. If you're GPS, there's other ways I think you can do this. And I think I've heard of this, unless I'm making it up, which I don't think I am, but If you have really good GPS guidance, you can also be planting in between the rows of cover crop that you sowed. So if you're planting a cover crop on like 8-inch, 7.5, 8-inch rows, and your GPS is that good, you can try planting between those so that you're not planting into the root balls of those cover crop plants. Again, that's technology that we don't have in our research operation. The last thing, this is the thing that we do. We've bought what's called Residue Slicers. And what it is it's a super, it's a heavy press wheel that runs in front of your planter. There's a lot of down pressure on it, and it basically holds the residue down. And then there's a sharp, straight coulter that comes through and just slices a slit right where you're gonna plant. We used that for the first time last year, and it worked really well. We used it for corn, not for soybeans yet, I don't think, no. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. If you don't have a lot of residue, you can try residue cleaners in front, but in my experience, those just wrap up and turn into a kind of a mess. So those are some ways that you can try to plant into that heavy residue.
Okay, I think, Erin, one thing I think you made the comment earlier, and I'm going to repeat it just to make sure that I heard it correctly, and then you can correct me if I didn't hear it. What you're saying is the cover crop is not going to replace a need for chemical control, but because that cover crop could reduce the total weed number or weed pressure and could result in some smaller weeds, which might make the chemical control more effective.
That is what I would like to say, yes. I think that there are some cases where you might be able to eliminate an application. Again, like if depending what you do to manage mare's tail that comes up in the fall, that might be one of those cases. But I think that the way that we, with the threats that we have now with herbicide resistant weeds and seed production from those weeds, and the way that we are managing cover crops, I really don't think we should be recommending using cover crop to substitute for something that's going to be controlling weeds in the soybean growing season. It's too risky to do that. Now, if we ever get to this future where we can do more spot spraying with robotic weeders or what have you, that might be a possibility. But really, I think the better way to think about it is improving the efficacy of the applications we are going to make.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I guess one challenge I got a question about is when you're getting the biomass to create the pressure to suppress weeds, you're probably also getting to a point where you're elevating some risk for potential diseases into the soybean crop. Has that been observed in any of your studies so far?
We've not had problems with disease, and I'm trying to access my memory banks about other research that's been done on soybean disease. The disease issue following cover crops, I'm gonna fall over, tends to be more of a concern with corn than it does with cereal rye. Carl Bradley and I had thrown around the idea of trying to do a disease, soybean disease following legume cover crops things. And a lot of the diseases that we're gonna have with the annual legume cover crops just aren't gonna be transmitting to soybeans. I think we have a couple of things working in our advantage. Soybeans tend, sorry, I'm going to say it, to be planted a little bit later. They don't quite get into the same stressful soil conditions that corn can get into, where it gets planted earlier, it can be wetter, it can be colder, and corn just doesn't like that. And soybeans are a little bit more amenable to those early season stresses. That's in my experience. We can have issues with slugs and diseases. We're actually part of slugs and insects. We're part of a big project that's going to start looking at that in corn, and we'll also hopefully be looking at that in soybeans soon as well.
Okay, great. How I don't see another question that's come in just
So
yet.
Chad, I
Hi,
dug
Carrie.
up the profitability. Can you see the slide?
It is trying to share,
Trying.
but that might be me and not anybody else.
Okay, so we'll just punt that. Basically, the only treatment in the work we looked at that had a net benefit or was profitable was the increased seeding rate. And it was
Okay.
almost $12 per acre benefit when you're talking 889 beans. Okay.
Okay.
So, and basically that goes back to the fact that we were able to harvest that 140 to 150 plants per acre. But it was a
Okay.
substantial net benefit that we thought was pretty large.
Okay. All right. So that's encouraging. And it's also occurring in summers where we've had above average rainfall, which we've had enough of those back to back to back that our averages are going to be changing as a result of that.
But it's also predicted to continue, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it fits very well with what we think we're going to be seeing going forward for a while. And I see Carl Bradley is on here, and he said that some root rot pathogens and potentially soybean cyst nematode would share some cover crop and soybeans as hosts. So depending upon those species, there may be some carryover that way. Although I don't think we see too many legumes. I'm assuming legumes, maybe he's meaning other species. We don't see too many legumes in front of a soybean, but I know that there was some work done on some winter annual weeds a while back where they thought there might be some commonality that way as well. So, we're talking about putting various biologicals into the system. Those biologicals can always have a bit of an impact one way or the other. Okay, we're up against the clock. Chris, I think we're going to take a 5-minute break, give you a chance to get your stuff set up, give everybody else a chance to warm up a cup of coffee, put another log on the fire, and we'll be good to go if that works for everybody. So we will see you all here in about 5 minutes.
Thanks, everybody.
Chad, just make sure I have this on right when I get to that stage. Oh, shoot. Now, how do we do this?
So you're good there. Now up in the top left corner, there's a little arrow that says from beginning. Up, right down. You're almost to it. Sorry. You've got your autosave, your file, and then there's a little says from beginning on it. There you go.
Okay, so you guys can see that, right? You don't see my slides in the side?
I don't see your slide yet, your full screen slide. So let's, it says something about resume slideshow. Hit that beginning thing one more time. Let's see if we can figure it out. Here we go. Okay, now we're seeing the presenter view. So there you go. Okay, now you're good to go. And you're on mute.
Now you see just my one slide, right?
Now we see just the one slide and hear you loud and clear.
All right, thank you, sir. I'll be back on in a minute.
Okay. All right, we'll leave that up. All right. If my clock is right, we've hit the 5-minute mark. Hopefully everybody got a chance to get something, a little snack or something. And we're happy to get into our next segment of the discussion. And this one's going to be a fun one because we've got a farmer that's visiting with us today from Finksburg, Maryland. Chris Weaver is a 6th-generation farmer from that area. He farms with his father and his mother, Richard and Lila, his wife, Megan, their 2 children, Mackenzie and Charlie. They have a beef cattle feedlot, and they primarily grow corn and soybean. Chris started his quest on growing high-yield beans about 12 years ago. They've increased their yields over the last 12 years to over 100 bushels per acre. They have learned to watch the crop to increase yields. They do testing on 200 acres, and they test different products to see what works best on soybeans to increase yields in their farm. Chris says that their farm is always open for other farms to come and take a tour. And so with that, Chris, we thank you for joining us today. As you mentioned earlier, you've got a little deeper snowpack than what we've got here. Looking outside right now, we're running about 3.5, 4 inches. I think we got a little ways to catch up with you all just yet. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So yes, like Chad just said, I am a 6th-generation farmer, about 45 minutes from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, hour and a half from Baltimore. Primarily a corn and bean operation. We also run a beef cattle feedlot. I run all day-to-day operations. You guys, I'm going to open up my farm to you. As you see through this presentation, we're going to really dive in, opening up the box, cut the sides down, and dig into what you guys need to learn about bean production and how to do it. So we also do run a 200-acre research farm, as well as a greenhouse. We do all of our own in-house testing. It is all paid for by me. So we have no outside funding. We handle everything in-house, and I'll share some of that data along with you today. So let's jump in and let's take a little dive into soybean production. One of the best things is you'll see some pictures here, Uncle Tom, controlling the controllables. We're really big at controlling every facet of our operation from start to finish. That means, like Chad just said, we have 12 inches of snow on the ground. Up until we got 12 inches of snow last week, we've been busy spreading lime. So one thing about the state of Maryland, we have nutrient management plans. We are heavily regulated because of the Chesapeake Bay. So we are not allowed to spread any commercial fertilizers from November 1st to March 1st. And in doing that, we're allowed to just do potash and lime. So we've been out busy spreading potash and lime, getting prepared for 2021. I'm going to show you some slides on how we prepare. We also cannot spread any of our cattle manure until after March 1, as well as we have nutrient management plans. We have conservation plans. I sit on the local soil conservation board, as well as my father sits on numerous boards, and Uncle Tom does as well. He sits on the weed board. So the first thing into getting into high yielding beans is, let me find out where my, now we got a glitch here. Oh, there we go. Is you got to have a good team. So right there is Uncle Tom and Nate. Nate works for us full time. Uncle Tom and Nate and I, we do a lot of talking along with my father in the shop. That's my daughter, Mackenzie, my son, Charlie, and my wife, Megan. Without a good team, guys, you can't get ahead. So we talk out ideas. We review soil samples. We do everything together. Why? Because we need to make sure we're all on the team. One person I'll introduce you to throughout this presentation is Ed. Ed runs all 200 acres of the research facility, as well as helps me in the greenhouse throughout the year so we can test numerous products. We test a lot of different products throughout our throughout the year. We grow them in the greenhouse. We do 3 years of greenhouse research, and then we'll move it into field test trial plots if we see 3 years of positive ROI or positive feedback. One of the other things, I just want to take a minute. I am one of the instructors to the MAC school. So if you do want to jump in and get into higher yielding beans, please take time, check out MAC on the website. Kevin Cobb handles the corn. I go ahead and I talk about high yielding beans. There's Uncle Tom and Kevin in that picture. So high yielding beans, it all starts at the planter. So right now we have 4 planters, excuse me. 2 for beans, 2 for corn. We start going through the planters probably about December 1st. We'll chest meters. We'll go over every facet, replace every part. If it looks like it's wearing out, we replace it. So we control all the controllables, is like we like to say. So every planter comes in, gets rebuilt, restarted from every season. And our optimum goal is the picket fence. So this is some of our bean fields. We, just like corn, we're trying to achieve picket fence stands on beans. Okay. I don't like to see gaps. I don't like to see any issues out there in the soil, any issues out there on the farm. So that is why we go back, we rebuild every planter from year in the end. The picture there is Nate and Ori. Ori's the planter guy. I call him the planter god, actually. I do not do anything until Ori gives his thumbs up that the planter is ready to head into the field. Ori will pull every planter. We check everything from closing wheel setup to how's it planting, singulation. I don't believe the monitors. I believe Ori. So we check every facet in what we're doing. These are the things we can control before we get to the field for our crop. All of our corn we'll start planting around April 15th. We'll also start planting beans at the same time. I'm a firm believer that we need to be planting our beans as early as possible, as well as when we're ready to plant corn, we're right there planting beans. So some of the things that we do, choosing the right seed and the right fertilizer. So we're predominantly 100% liquid as far as fertilizer goes. Seed, we pick seed like we pick corn hybrids. We plant anywhere from a 2.7 all the way up to a 5.2 soybean. So we will look at any facet of the bean to achieve our optimum yields. What does the bean have to bring to the table? We're looking at each seed as we're looking for corn. Standability, how's it on disease package, down the line. Metribuzin tolerance, salt tolerance, because we're predominantly 100% liquid. Fertility. We keep controlling all the controllables. We actually own our own seed treater. We keep the seed treater in-house. We do fungicides, insecticides. We have seen an ROI on it. So we continue to also run a Elevo for cyst nematode as well as other things. This is Nate. Nate runs the seed treater in-house. We also believe that one of the big products we have seen a yield bump on is ABM's product Marauder as an inoculant. Keep in mind, not all inoculants are created equal. We've done numerous years of testing on inoculants. So before we would make a decision, we have seen 5-6 years of positive ROI using Marauder in our test treatments. I will tell you guys along the way what has worked and what hasn't worked. So, I'm just going to share it with you. So in our 200 acres of field test trials, we've had good results and we've had bad results. So one of the big things is, guys, for our operation that really brings a bang for our buck is humics. So the one in the glass jar, that's Monty's humic. The other two are other humics that jammed up our filters and screens. So you guys being in Kentucky, you should all be familiar with Monty's plant food products. Monty's is our really go-to humic, as you'll see through this presentation. For us to get ahead in bean yield, humics have been a major key in with all we're doing. In our last 10, 12 years, we have 250 acres out of 600 in beans that we have been continuous bean on bean now for 10 years. And we're increasing yields on those as well. Our total bean yield for 2020 in a drought was 6 years. Total farm average, we grew 94 bushel beans. So that was 94 bushel was our farm average, just so everybody is aware of that. That takes in consideration deer damage, everything down the line. So in our research test trials, we open it up to everybody. Ed is standing there at the end. He brings everybody in after we walk the plots, and you're welcome to look at anything. We don't shy back, but Ed will sit down. Ed talks to everyone in the room. I kind of let Ed handle the research facility along with myself. He gives all the tours. He loves seeing people. Along the way, we've met a lot of good people up there. Goose hunting is actually my good buddy from Arkansas, Perry Galloway, along with Joe Debman. So as we're achieving our higher yield in beans, I've met a lot of great people along the way. We've had the U.S. Grain Council out. That's Chip Council in that photo up there. They do a lot of bringing tours out from DC as well to our farm so we can answer questions and show them what we're doing with achieving high yielding beans and still being within our nutrient management rules and regulations. So doing research is pretty timely. As you can see, Charlie and Mackenzie like to do a lot of sitting around. There's Nate. We're doing stalk analysis. He's sending all stalk samples after all research. And then we actually run a New Holland combine that has scales in the hopper to do all of our research. So we scale, we use a yield monitor, and then we actually have on-farm scales that we weigh every test trial by truck too, so we can double check 3 different. So we're pretty elaborate in our testing trials, and we do everything for 3 years before we'll tell anybody what we're seeing. So when the planter and the fertilizer are correct, everything is starting to work. To get to the next step in high yielding crops, you got to have the picket stand. I walk these fields every week personally. Charlie and I get on the 4-wheeler. We're out there every week. We're out there every other week tissue sampling. I believe that if we're going to get ahead, I have to take a personal investment. I have to take time out. I walk every single field personally to make sure everything is handled from weed control down the line. We don't have any deficiencies. These are a lot of the partners that I have found that have worked good for us over the last few years. I'm just sharing with you guys what we've seen. I am a big component of fungicides and plant food products, so I'm just sharing along the data that we've found along the way. Here's a picture of Nate planting some beans with the 111 row planter. The one thing about high yielding beans that I can tell everyone is it's a lot of work. You will not be going to the beach with your family in the middle of the summer. You will always be working. We start as soon as the beans come up out of the ground. I start walking the fields. My wife is very fortunate. A date night for us is she makes dinner and we go out on the back of the gator and we're walking fields together. So I'm very fortunate to have a good support staff and a good team. So along the way, a lot of questions that have been asked. Row spacings, 7.5, 15, or 30-inch rows. We have made all 3 of those high yielding beans. We've got them all over 100 bushels. So I don't care about the drill spacing, 7s, 15s, or 30s. We have shown over 10 years of data where we can get each one of those to go over 100 bushel each. So as far as I'm concerned, you can use the planter, the drill, whatever you already have in hand, and we can help you along the way to achieve that. Planting, population decisions, that goes back to the variety of the bean. We can plant anywhere from 110,000 to 185,000. It really depends on the variety of the bean. You'll see a partner that's linked in. As I said, always make sure you have a good team. You'll see part of my team in my planting decisions and my seed selections for population here in a second. Seed depth. I plant every single bean we have at 2 inches deep. I don't care if it's early. I don't care if it's a double crop. I'm always at 2 inches. I want that plant to be down in the ground, always to make sure we can get the most vigor out of the plant from fertility. Inoculants. We are strictly through research. 100% with ABM inoculants, SaberX. We do a planter box with SaberX, as well as we also treat with Marauder at our seed treater. In furrow products, we are huge with Monty's plant food in furrow. We found that they're low salt, as you'll see here in a few slides coming up. Just because a company says they're low salt doesn't really mean that they're low salt. And we have found out through years and years of testing that Monty's is. So all of our in-furrow products are used 100% they're Monty's products in furrow. 2x2 application, we do not have 2x2 on any of our planters. So I'm just letting everyone know we just stick with the in-furrow, as well as we'll come back and utilize our sprayer as much as possible. From the time the beans come up from V1, I pretty much live in a sprayer all season long. Fungicides and insecticides. I am a huge fungicide and insecticide component. You guys got to get with your local co-op and your local reps and find those fungicides and insecticides that work for you in your area. But I am a firm believer you need to start early and often on both. Keep all the insect pressure and all the disease pressure out of the fields. Like I said, we've been bean on some fields over 10 years, and we're increasing our yields because of fungicide, insecticide, and the use of humics. Humics has been the real big game changer. I know it's new on the market. A lot of people don't know much about it. We've been using humics since 2011. It's really helping on plant health is what we're seeing. I think if you guys, or I don't think, I do know, if you want to get to the next level and consistently be growing over 100 bushel beans, humics are the key for that, because we're buffering salt, we're feeding microbes, and moving along the way. Foliar applications. We do these as necessary. We are very big on tissue sampling, as you'll see here in the next couple of upcoming slides. We believe very much in foliar fertilizing, wide dropping as needed, whatever the plant needs. We do not starve the plant. Okay. We are making sure that plant has adequate nutrients throughout the entire growth stage of this plant. Secret to high yielding beans is never to starve this plant. Put everything out there this plant needs. Give it all it's got. If you are looking at your soil samples, go off your base saturations. Pay attention to the base saturations, not your ppms as much, and make sure that this plant has the proper amount of nutrients out there from start to finish. If you see you're high in magnesium, lower your magnesium levels, because all that's going to do is cause phosphorus and zinc tie up in your plant. And remember, all high yielding beans start with a healthy plant at emergence. Like you can see in that middle picture, that plant is struggling to get up out of the ground. That is just hurting your yield. You've pretty much right there caused yourself 15 bushel if your plant's having to fight to get out of the ground. Pretend every plant is a little baby, a little child. Are you going to let that little child, have to climb out and overtop his crib, or are you going to help him in and out for the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks of its life? You're going to help it out. Do the same thing on soybean and corn production. Pay attention to every controllable that you can control. This is very key in high yielding bean production. Once we get started, there's a picture of my daughter out in the field. All we do is tissue sample, and I'm constantly in the sprayer. We run a smaller sprayer with less wheel tracks. We stick on the same tram line. We are constantly out there spraying. Anything that the plant needs based off that tissue sample, we're feeding that plant. When I got involved in this and came back to take over the farm in 2010, my father and my Uncle Tom both looked at me and they thought I was crazy. What are you doing looking at this and spraying that much? Over the years, I've actually given up ground and I've built more grain bins. Why is that? Because we're producing more beans on less acres. I'm producing more corn on less acres. And we're doing that from the use of tissue samples, soil samplings. We're controlling all the controllables in-house. Where I live, development is very prevalent. Farmland's going away. So I need to figure out, how do I get my kids, the 7th generation, to be profitable? Well, I can tell you the way I'm doing it is I'm increasing my yields per acre on ground that we own. I'm able to say on 1,300 acres, I'm growing more today than my dad and Uncle Tom did on 2,000 plus acres. So as you're looking at everything, I want to be consistently growing 200 bushel beans. That's my personal goal. And I'm going to get there. This year we had some good results that you guys will see to get us up to 94 bushel. 94 bushel is not my personal best for farm average. So I told you along the way, it's always a team. There's my father and Tom. They give farm tours to anyone that wants to come out. We open up our farm. We show everybody the facets of what we're doing. We don't hide anything from anyone. You come out, do the tour. We'll answer any questions. We'll sit down. We'll talk things out with you. So there's a picture of Ed in the shop. And one of the big things is the gentleman with him is Myron Stein, the son of Harry Stein. We talk out plant varieties. We talk out plant population. We talk out everything that we're doing with the Stein family to get us ahead, get us to the next level. They're very much a part of our team. And you keep hearing me say the word team. It's because without a good team, we're nothing. You know, we have not been able to get ahead. You know, I had to take and show Tom and Dad that I can run the business a different way and think outside the box and increase yields. I feel to this day that Dad and Tom love it every time I tell them we have to build a new grain bin, because they know that we're getting to the next level somewhere else. So right now we're in the process of building another 12,000 bushel bean bin for 2021 because of where we're heading in bean production. So components of high yielding beans that I can control, plants per acre. How do we figure that out? We figure that out by what variety of bean we're planting on that ground. We look at, is it shaly? Is it a hillside? We have a lot of HEL soils. So we have to be looking at soil, beans that can deal with shale. Can they handle a sandier knob? Can they handle clay-based soils? We are non-irrigated, so none of our ground gets irrigated along the way. Plant nodes. How many can we get per plant? Is it a white flower? Is it a purple flower? This all takes in control what we're thinking about. Pods per node. This is influenced by me, you. The pods per node are influenced by you because of the way you plant the bean, the way you fertilize the bean, the way you take care of that bean for the first 6 weeks. If you just plant the beans, walk away, let the co-op guy go out and scout them for you, and he tells you when to spray and what to spray, you're going to be in that 60 bushel bean yield the rest of your life. In order to control the pods per node, you got to be thinking outside the box. You got to be looking at what is a controllable I can control. Well, this is one of them. Take care of that plant. Make sure that everything we're doing is at the next stage in what we're doing. The seeds per pod. That is a 5 bean pod that we found on our farm. I am going to tell you, it used to be a couple years ago, I got excited when we had a stalk full of 3 bean pods. I don't get excited now over 3 bean pods at all. I like it when we're getting between 30 to 104 bean pods per stalk. Okay. It's to the point now, I don't even count 2 bean pods and 1 bean pods on anything that we're doing to influence. So as we're getting ahead in the next few years, I expect, and everybody that's on my team knows that I don't want 4 bean pods. I want 5 bean pods on every stalk. And we're in the hunt for a 6 bean pod now. We are going to make sure we're one of the first to see the 6 bean pod. You know, we found, it took me about 6 years to find a 5 bean pod this year that you'll see here in a minute. But I want to make sure we're controlling every controllable. I want the 6 bean pod first. Seed size. We do not plant BBs. If we get a BB size soybean in, we end up shipping it back out. We only want to have big beans. And we only plant big beans on our farm. Weight of seed, that equates in the seed size. So we look at big seeds, which is a heavier bean. When we get down to it, I've grown 57, 58, 57, 57.5 test weight on beans. I know it's 60. I've never hit 60-pound test weight beans yet, but we are getting the yields to match up in what we're doing. I've already said early on, tissue sampling is a must. So we do tissue sample every other week. I constantly am feeding that plant what that plant needs. Fungicide, insecticide, we are monitoring it. I am an agronomist. Okay. Besides being a farmer, I am my own agronomist. I handle everything in-house. I have an agronomy degree. I handle my own data collection on products that we want to look at. I want to handle everything in-house so I can control all the controllables. And getting into high yielding beans, you need to control the controllables. These are pictures of our leaves. We try to make sure every leaf is healthy. We use fungicides to do so. You know, I'm a big Veltima user now. I feel Veltima is the next step to get us ahead. When we want to talk to chemical and fertilizer companies, I call the rep. They come into our shop and meet them. I included a picture there on the side of the beans. You see a little bronzing. That was with 3 weeks, no rain. And I doubled the rate of sulfur this year. sulfur is huge in bean production. If you guys aren't using sulfur yet, you need to be really seriously looking at sulfur. We're using oodles of sulfur throughout our bean, high yielding bean production. And we treat every acre as it's high yielding beans. We just don't hunt and pick. Everything's high yielding beans on our farm. So this was what happened after no rain and a heavy sulfur treatment. You'll notice we got a little bronze, nothing bad. I actually have been trying to kill plants for 12 years and I can't. I've tried and still have been unsuccessful. My ultimate goal is to kill bean plants, if that is at all possible, to see how far I can push them. And I have not. We're growing healthier plants. As you guys will see, I like to call them kind of bean trees more than bean plants for what we're doing. We do replace cutter bars pretty regular throughout the season. One of the things that we do, we utilize the Varus mapping system. Instead of going grid samples every acre, we utilize Varus. We've tried all the satellite imagery and we just couldn't get the yield results that we were needing to get to on high yielding bean production. So we are looking at every soil test. We bring it in, we're treating every area. We variable rate fertilizer. We're making sure we don't produce enough manure on our operation to utilize manure enough because we're composting it because of nutrient management regulations that we're faced under on a daily basis. But by doing the Varus data, we're ended up being able to put the nutrients where it needs to go, and we're able to monitor each separate zone that we have on our farm. These are some of our bean plants. I threw them on top of the service truck this year as I was cutting them down. We try to make sure that all of our plants get equal treatment throughout the whole production. I'm not really worried about a bean ever lodging because they interweave themselves so much on our operation. So these are a couple of the plants that we have. Being here in the mid-Atlantic, I am susceptible to hurricanes. So with our philosophy of getting out, starting early and starting often and controlling all the controllables, we're able to grow what I like to consider a bean tree. You'll see some more pictures of them coming up. So our yields over the last couple years, we started out, this is HH22. It's a field that I picked at random. We started this over 10 years. So when I took over, we were going 67 bushel beans. You know, you get into 2014, 2013, I finally got over 100 bushel. Happy. Every time I think I finally have it understood, I know everything that's going on, I've gone backwards. In 2015 was the first time that we grew over 120 bushel beans. I was ecstatic. Ed, Dad, everybody couldn't believe we got over the 120 bushel mark. But once again, got a little cocky, got a little arrogant. I know what I'm doing. 2016 rolled around, I went down. So we take our base fundamentals that we have learned using Armani's carbon, Armani's sugar, and that is what has propelled us to getting to the next stages. So we take our next level products and we get to where we're heading. In 2017 was that moment for us where we said, okay, we're on to something. We got to 128 bushel beans. From 2017, we have not slid below that mark. We do have some fields that have deer damage that are not pushing us to take away from our yield. This field here was a very mismanaged field when I took it over in 2010, and we did a lot of work to it. We got it up and running. This year in 2020, I grew over 150 bushel beans. I'll explain that to you in a minute. But this field here did over 148 bushel. The one thing I pride myself on is I am not a really good picture taker. So I can't harvest, take pictures, do weights. I have to stop the machine to get there. When you're cutting 148 bushel beans, I was going 0.6 miles an hour. And I still had some hiccups. And I'm going to share my hiccups with you along the way of doing all this. You know, I don't want you guys to think it's all just you go out, you spray, you plant, and it's all over with. There are a lot of hiccups, a lot of issues that come with growing high yielding beans. But I was very blessed. You know, that 148 bushel mark is a lot to do with my team talking out ideas. getting feedback from those guys. I listen to everyone. My granddaddy always had a philosophy: if you want the job done the easiest, ask the lazy man on the crew, and he'll tell you how to do it the easiest way. Well, one thing that Nate and everyone on the team here will tell you, I will not do things the laziest way. We'll do things the hardest way to get to the end result. And it's been paying dividends for us. So here's a picture of Nate. He's got a bean tree in his hand this year. We're very fortunate that that bean plant there had over 400 4-bean pods on it, had over 500 3-bean pods. I didn't even count the 2s and 1s on the plant. That screenshot, if you notice, I had to stop the machine because I wasn't good enough to be able to drive and take a picture. I don't know how these young kids can Zoom, FaceTime, do everything while operating the combine, because I know I can't. But that was our beans so far, combining a new farm that I just purchased this year. We were doing 157 bushel beans on that farm when I opened it up. One of the coolest things is when you're doing those kind of beans, you're able to fill the tank on the combine pretty quick. So I don't care if it's a red combine, a green combine, it's all your personal preference. So we won't go there. There's a picture of one of our bean trees. That's actually on 30-inch rows that we have there in the field. We're really happy because if you guys can take a look, there's a lot of 4-bean pods on that plant. We're playing with more 30-inch row beans right now, just because I think that's the way we're going to head in the future, because we can get more 12 rows. But I'm just sharing with you, it's not a major decision yet, but it's something that we're looking into. So these are our bean plants planted this year. We planted May 5th. The picture in the middle is our beans on July 14th. If you go and look, same field, there's our bean plants planted August 1st. So we pride ourselves, we try to take a lot of pictures throughout the year. As you'll see, there's a picture of me giving a tour up in the other corner. I am not worried if beans lodge. Rain events come through where we got 3 to 4 inches of rain within 2 hours and the beans are flat. Our bean plants are so healthy that by the next day, they're back up. And I'm not worried. When they intertwine, they will not fall over. Okay? We do use nitrogen on our beans. So we are pushing every facet of our operation through and in hand with Brian Butler, an extension agent at the University of Maryland. He and I do a lot of testing from rye for distilling all the way up to bean production. And we're pretty much the anomaly in everything that we're doing, because what we're told not to do is what we're doing. And it's working for us to get over 100 bushel beans. As you can see from the pictures, I believe in branching. I believe in potting. We're trying to push every facet of that operation. It all starts with the inoculant, to the seed treatment, to picking the right bean for the right acre, in our opinion. Here's a picture of the 5-bean pod, of course. I couldn't leave that out. I'm pretty proud of that. There is a product out that we're using pretty extensively right now. It's called Midnight by Monty's, and I wanted to point this out. A lot of our success is because of this product. It basically makes you think, or makes the bean plant think it is daytime at nighttime. And it has been it's been one of the reasons we've been so successful with our bean crop. On that plant, that is where you're starting to notice a lot of 4-bean pods for us. Now, that's why we're pushing the 5-bean pod, and we want to be the first out with a 6-bean pod. So I want to give you guys just a little glimpse into everything we got going on. Ed, our right-hand man there, what we do is Ed gives most of the farm tours. There's Ed holding a bean plant out of the farm research stuff. He gives all the farm tours. Ed enjoys meeting with everybody, talking to everybody. He'll share everything that we're doing with everyone. Along the way, Ed gets in a lot of pictures. There's a picture of Ed with our 128 bushel beans that year. The picture in the middle, that is actually the 150 plus bushel bean field. And where the green combine is, that's us harvesting 136 bushel that year. The big takeaway that year for us on the 136 bushel was from start to finish, the beans were 136 bushel across the field. It never varied. We were able to finally get and control the controllable of tabletop beans, is what I like to call it. One end of the field to the other end of the field, we were 130 to 140 beans. We didn't see any big major spikes. This is letting me know that we are on the right track to high yielding bean production for the fact that we're controlling consistency throughout the field. We got the soils right. We've been able to manipulate everything going forward. Some setbacks. Along the way, we test a lot of products. That is a brand new John Deere pump, used one time in that picture. As you can see, the white film at the bottom, that's high in salt. This rep came to us. We did some testing for him. Said to me, he goes, "Hey, Chris, you know, we have a low salt product. Does that look like a low salt product to you?" I know you guys are, this is why it's better to be face to face. I get a little bit more interaction, but no, it's not a low salt product. We did one fill up. We came back, and this is what we noticed from this. This was a corn plot that we started with. There's the pictures of our planter right afterwards, where the salt just started eating up our planter. Well, let me tell you, that does not make myself, Dad, Tom happy, because that's an additional cost where we actually revamp that whole planter the next year. So one of the things I'll leave you with is, just because someone tells you it's low salt, don't believe it. Do all the testing that you have out there. Check all the products, okay? Look at everything that you guys can do. You know, don't take yes as the answer, ask why. And when they give you an answer, ask why again. Double check everything that's going on. So that's a spline shaft, as you guys can see. So growing 148 plus bushel beans, take your eye off the head for a second and look down. This is what happens. I broke that. That was me running the combine. I was going 0.6 miles an hour, and I twisted the spline shaft because the beans coming in came in so fast. I just looked away for 1 second. This is what happens. So, you know, when I'm saying this, now I'm glad we have another combine so we could keep cutting beans in that time period. But in high yielding bean production, you can't take your eye off the prize. If that is planting, spraying, to harvesting, don't count your eggs until they're actually in the hopper of the combine. As you guys can see there, that was a pretty expensive fix for me for just looking away for a minute. One slide I always like to show is to give everybody a little inkling of salt. You know, you hear me talk a lot of humics. It's because we're trying to lower the amount of salt. These are a lot of the products most of you guys are probably using, and you're going to be able to see here how high they are in salt. Imagine the yield inhibitants you are now causing to yourself because of the amount of salt that you guys are seeing. So pay attention. If you don't use a humic right now on your farm, please start trying one. You know, in high yielding beans, it was the first step for us to get ahead because we're limiting the amount of salt that we have. Here coming up in 2021, that's a good friend of mine, Temple Rhodes. I can't tell you my exact bean yield because it's going to be on a show airing here on RFD TV soon called Podfathers. But I will tell you it was over 150 bushel. So please check in that show. There's my email address. Is there any questions? I'll be more than glad to answer anything anyone has.
All right. Thank you, Chris. I see one question that came in. It said, if you exclude land and machinery, what is your average cost per bushel? And so I assume
Average
that's
cost
over,
is over 400. Oh, sorry.
I assume that's
average
over your
cost,
whole
ground
farm.
Over whole farm, ground rent, crop insurance, seed costs, fertilizer costs. We have around $410, $412 an acre. But I can tell you at that 410, 412, we're netting that same amount on the other side. So we're producing over $800 an acre at $8.80 beans.
Okay.
Mhm. But we take in consideration, just so everybody knows, land, equipment, manpower costs. We look at every single facet of everything we do to get that per acre, per bushel cost. Trucking, hauling, combining is all in that.
So what variety of soybeans have you been planting to get those 120 plus bushels?
We're primarily Stein and all Agrigold. Stein and Agrigold beans to get to those levels. We 90% Stein, 10% Agrigold beans. We are all we were LLGT 22s with Stein, which we're all switching to all enlist this year. One of the big things we're hearing is a lot of landowners are asking us not to plant dicamba beans for what they're seeing in the Wall Street Journal ads that dicamba is the next Roundup. So we are going primarily all enlist for 2021.
Okay. One came in that said a 2-inch planting depth seems interesting yet challenging. Are you doing tillage or no tillage?
We've been no-till for over 20 years. You're not going to go 15, 16 miles an hour. I don't care how fancy of a planter you get. Some of my friends, there's a good buddy in Indiana named Terry Vissing, likes to pick on me. I like to go about 3.6 to 4 miles an hour. Going 3.6, 4 miles an hour, we have not had any issues where we're not at 2-inch planting depth. Check your gauge wheels, check your down pressure. We run airbags on all of our row units, and we haven't had any issues.
Okay. And most of your soils are silt loam on the surface. I know you get over in parts of Maryland, you can get some pretty variability when you get closer to the coast.
So what we have is primarily silt loam. We get some sand hills. We're really spent a lot of time down in Kentucky. So around Shelbyville, our soils are kind of similar to what Shelbyville is. Silt loam, we get some sandy hills. We got a lot of clay. So we can have 15 different soil samples in a 10-acre field, or soil types in a 15-acre field. We are hilly. So, it's not easy. I saw another question pop up here, Chad. We do apply humics more than once. Yes, we do apply humics at pre-plant, pre-spray. Anytime we see anything that is a high salt product, we're mixing a humic in with that to buffer the salt. And like I said, I included my email address. You can feel free to email me at any time. Ooh. After planting, what are the top 3 things a grower should try? I'll be really quick and easy on this one. Carbon, sugar, and sulfur. Besides your fungicide, those are the 3 big things. And you guys are lucky you're there in Kentucky. All those come from a Kentucky-based company, Monty's. And those are the products that we like to use. So those would be my top 3 things if you were going to try anything.
Other questions from anybody? I don't see any coming in at the moment, Chris.
I can stay on. I'm good. If anybody's got anything, they can email me, Chad. Whatever they need, they can email away. Thank you for having me.
Okay. All right.
Hold on 1 second. Can you touch on population by variety? I can tell you, as part of our team, we will plant anywhere from a 2.7 to 5.2 bean. We actually look at the population, what unit is planting it, and we'll talk out the variety, as well as we will look at the soils that we're going to plant it on, what field did we pick it for, so that we could be anywhere from 110,000 to 180,000 plant population. So I can't just say what variety are we planting where. We're looking at beans like we look at corn. Okay. You don't plant all your corn at 28, 32,000. You're looking at the hybrid. Does it flex? Doesn't it flex? We look at the thing in bean characteristics now. we're taking it to the next step. We want to know everything about that bean variety that we can gather. That's why we deal primarily with Stein, because most of your beans, if you buy from other companies, they come from Stein now. So that's why I stick with those guys. They can give me more insight on the bean than anyone else. So to answer that question honestly, we look at the field, the variety, what machine is planting it to come up with our plant populations. We have considered Y dropping because of our hills. We do not Y drop because we can't stick the sprayer onto the field. We are primarily foliar, or we've designed our own drop tube to go down below the canopy that we use in place of that. So that's something, feel free to call me on. I can talk in depth on that. How frequently do you apply foliar fertilizers based? To answer that question, Susan, it really depends on the tissue sample. If we're coming back with a deficiency, we apply based on the tissue sample. There's more times where when we're walking the field every week, we're already spraying before the tissue sample's back because we already see something coming into the plant. The tissue sample is really just for us to know that we did the right thing. We could do up to 2 to 3 passes with a foliar. We try to make a bang for every buck. So if we can go through the field, add a fungicide, add an insecticide, herbicide, we're doing that all at the same time. So
when you pull a tissue sample, are you pulling from different spots in the field or just one spot, or how do you do that?
So what we've done is we do a flag test. We're checking our emergence, and then we lay out a certain section. We lay out 250 feet. What we'll do every other week is we actually take the sample from that section and we go out and take all the new growth leaves out of that section. So we're pulling out of the same section of the field, but if it's a 10-acre field, we probably have one section. If it's a 50-acre field, we're probably having 6 or 7 sections we're pulling out of in order to make judgment calls. But we'll take that section out of it. We'll pull leaf samples out of the first 50 feet and then the next 50 feet and just keep moving on and on. Can you touch base on what you put in furrow and or what not to put in furrow? So I'm going to tell you real basic. We stick with a real simple in furrow mix based off the fact, you got to look at that seed as a baby growing. So we don't want any salts. We have found out, so we run a liquid inoculant in furrow. We'll run carbon and sugar in furrow, and that's pretty much our in furrow treatment. We do not put any fertility in furrow. Rule of thumb is no more than 3 gallons of any products in furrow. So we try to stick very basic so we're not hurting the roots or frying the roots with high levels of salt. So in furrow, we keep it very simple just to get the plant moving and growing. Thank you, Mark. I'll be on, Chad, if anybody's got anything else, so we're good.
Okay, I think Becky is going to go ahead and share her screen to put up some credits so that folks that are looking for CCA credit can get those in. So why don't you go ahead and do that, Becky, in this process and share that. With that, I think most everybody on here that I recognize is already a member of the Soybean Association. If you're not, you should be. No better day than today to go ahead and become a member of the Kentucky Soybean Association. We all see a change in leadership in Washington. Obviously, we've had a change in leadership in Frankfurt a year ago. You need to have farmers at the table as part of the discussion, and your Soybean Association is part of that effort. So it's certainly worthwhile. There's that up on your screen now. If you need to scan that for your CCA credits, go ahead and do that. The soybean, they have one more workshop tomorrow, I believe, if I'm saying that correctly. And I hope you make it back for that one tomorrow. We appreciate Chris talking with us today, sharing some of his thoughts with us. We appreciate Carrie and Erin talking about some of the research that the Soybean Board's been funding and some of those results coming out of some of those studies. With that, I will go back to the chat box one more time. Chris, check it out and see if anybody else has got something in here. My suspicion is going to be that you're going to get a lot of individual emails coming to you later with some
I'm
follow-up questions at that point.
That, buddy.
All right. All right. So with that, thank you all very much for attending today. Hopefully you'll make it back for the next meeting tomorrow if you can. And we look forward to talking to you several more times and getting into spring before we know it. Hard to believe right now with snow on the ground, but it won't be long before it's here. So hope you all have a good day, and we will talk to you soon.